Welcome back, and welcome as well to Jeremy Golden, the director and founder of China Business Services, consultants specializing in helping international businesses operating in China. Thank you for coming to Business World Studio, Jeremy.
It's a pleasure.
My first question will be, please could you tell us about your company? What does China Business Services do?
Okay, well, basically the company helps international businesses with their strategy and risk management issues in China. One of the things that I found very early on being involved with China business is that you need a special way to approach the complexity of the China market. So what we try and do with the business is to use expert local resources all over China to help deliver these services for people. And that means finding people in specific locations, in specific functions, and with specialist knowledge of particular sectors so that we can triangulate those issues and provide people with real insight. Because as you will know, your lawyer in Hangzhou will not be able to do an effective job if they're in Shanghai or Beijing. You need local people to deliver the services in China.
So what are the opportunities that British companies want to operate in China?
Well, I think there are a lot of opportunities. You know, China is such a vast place and it's growing so quickly, and compared to the rest of the world, it looks like a big opportunity. So almost any area has opportunities. The questions then are really, how big is the opportunity and how much does it cost to address that opportunity, and what are the risks associated with the opportunity? So for some companies, you know, they look at these issues and they decide that maybe China's not right for them. But for a lot of businesses, obviously, there is a great opportunity in China. And you know, you look at the outcome of the Third Plenum and the National People's Congress, and you get very clear policy signals about the future development. So you've got economic rebalancing, the development of the consumer economy. These sorts of things give very clear indications of what sort of businesses and what areas in China businesses can focus on for the future.
So what are the challenges facing British companies in China?
Well, you know, business is always about opportunity and risk and finding the right balance. So I've done a lot of work on the risk side, which of course helps me to understand the problems that companies face when they develop their strategy. So it's a virtuous circle, really. I've actually just finished writing a book about risk in China and the importance of doing due diligence. Risky Business in China comes out in September. And some of the key risks that I've been able to highlight in that are around not only the internal problems that companies face. So these are how they develop their strategy, what resources they have available to implement the strategy, and the constraints that they put on themselves, including time constraints that become very limiting and often self-harming in the context of delivering the strategy in China. And then you've got the external risks, ranging from the sort of political risks through to, you know, operational risks and the risks surrounding compliance and particular individuals you might hire into your business. All of those can be managed with a bit of upfront due diligence. And you know, I wish more people would take those steps at the beginning of the process rather than trying to fix them when trouble hits later on in the process.
How can, you know, such problems, for example, linguistic and politics problems and different culture, different business approaches be overcome?
Well, I think it's important to understand the context that you're working in, not just in China, but in any market. And I know that some people think these cultural issues are a bit soft. You know, they just want to focus on the numbers and, you know, contracts and all these things. But actually, they really are important. First of all, the government. You've got to understand that the government in China has a very different structure and influence than governments in other places. So you really need to listen to what the government says in terms of its policies and planning, and keep an eye on how those policies and regulations are being implemented and enforced. So those are really important things. You know, if you don't look at those, you're going to end up cutting across policy rather than aligning with it, which is a big problem. When you get down to the operating level, you come across these issues of guanxi, for example. So guanxi connections, I think, you know, is quite cliched now. Everyone talks about it. But, you know, I've seen situations where people have lost millions of dollars because they thought they had a guanxi relationship, whereas in fact they had a business relationship that fundamentally changed the moment they signed a contract. So, you know, getting people to understand these issues is not about soft cultural issues, it's about practical business knowledge and your ability to deal with risk. It's the same with face. You know, you find in China that people are very concerned about their own face or loss of face, but also your loss of face as your counterpart. So when people are asking questions, for example, during a business due diligence process, sometimes people don't want to give the full answer, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. They might paper over some of the problems that lie beneath the surface because they don't want you or their superior to lose face. So it takes a little bit of close listening to what's being said so you can understand the implication of what's being said, even if it's not outlined very clearly. So that's an area where face can have a real impact on business as well.
It's very interesting. You mentioned 关系. So I think a lot of British people doesn't know, what is the 关系? Could you explain it?
Well, guanxi in the Chinese context is basically about connections and relationships, which are very central to Chinese culture and society. So it's something much stronger than what we might term a business relationship. And it's about building up a very strong relationship over a long period of time where you help somebody and then maybe in the future they will help you. And this is a very fundamental issue that people have to get to grips with.
What types of businesses tend to do well in China and why?
Yeah, it's a very big question, obviously. There are big companies and small companies that do well in China, but there are also lots of examples of companies that have failed. The companies that tend to do well are ones that are able to localize their management and structures so that they're better able to adapt themselves and their products and services to the local environment. You look at a company like the Danish company Danfoss, which has attempted to make China what they call their second home market. So they're really trying to localize themselves, make China a second home. 3M, the American company, is another good example. What they say is that they're in China for China. They're trying to become a local Chinese company. And I think for international companies wanting to operate in China, they really need to look at ways to sustainably localize their businesses for the long term. And also to make sure that what they offer changes with the changing demand in the market.
So you mean they need to contribute something to China?
I think it's essential. Foreign companies have been under the microscope in China recently. We're coming into an era of state-owned enterprise reform. Again, we did it during the 90s already, but this is a deeper reform through the deeper water, as Xi Jinping was saying. The government is sending out a message to the local vested interests as well as to international business that things have to change. This is the anti-corruption crackdown, reform of state-owned enterprises, a greater role for the private sector, the rebalancing of the economy, the role of market forces in resource allocation. And you'll know the Chinese expression of killing the chicken to scare the monkeys. And a lot of people are saying that this is what's happened at the moment. So you take a case like GSK in China, where they've been subject or embroiled in an anti-corruption and bribery campaign. This is a sign to the rest of the industry. It's not just GSK, but the rest of the industry, including the Chinese companies, that in the long term, the way that the industry operates has to change. So it's really important to keep an eye on those sorts of policy moves. And for a foreign company particularly, to go beyond just complying with the regulations. You've got to become a good corporate citizen and embed yourself in the community where you're operating.
What other areas of the British company and industry do you think have the potential to be successful in the future in China?
So in the past, people always talked about China market entry. How do I get into China? What sort of structure should I use to invest in China? What partner should I have for China? And that's still, an important part of the conversation. But increasingly, we're talking about China engagement because the China business opportunity is no longer just about the geography of China. It's also about Chinese people coming out of China, and these are the top end of the consumer market. So by next year, there should be more than 100 million Chinese people traveling overseas. And by 2020, I think that's going to rise to something like 200 million. There's a massive opportunity for people to sell products, services, real estate, anything else to this very wealthy traveling Chinese consumer. But equally, we're talking about the Chinese outbound market. So this is overseas investment by Chinese companies, in some cases acquisition of foreign brands or investment in foreign brands. We have Dalian Wanda buying Sunseeker in the UK last year. They've also got, I think, a massive development on the South Bank. There are Chinese developments in the Royal Albert Docks, in Crystal Palace, in Liverpool. We've got Chinese investment into the nuclear industry, and that's just in the UK. There's also an opportunity to work with them in third markets, sort of triangulate the opportunity. So British businesses have very strong footholds in, for example, parts of Africa and other parts of the world, where Chinese businesses are very keen to develop. So as well as selling into China, we have an opportunity to help Chinese companies with the UK as a base go global, into Europe, into Africa, into other markets, the US and elsewhere. So we have a really good opportunity that extends well beyond the traditional kind of China opportunity.
Do you think a Chinese outbound business, into overseas markets, they even have more difficulties compared with other, British companies enter into Chinese market?
I think anyone entering into a market other than their home market is going to have a number of challenges in terms of management resource, local culture, local policy and regulation, building trust, building the networks and relationships that make business function. So, a lot of the trouble that we had going into China 15, 20 years ago was due as much to our understanding as to the situation locally. And I'm sure Chinese investors going global will have some of the same challenges. But we have a fantastic service economy here in the UK that can help people overcome those barriers, hopefully without too much pain. And that's why the UK is such a popular destination for Chinese investment.
I think not all the British companies can have succeeded in Chinese market. So do you have any examples of ones have failed in China?
Well, I'm not sure it'd be fair of me to point out people that have failed, but certainly, there are varying degrees of success and failure with regard to the China market, and China is not for everyone at every time for their business. But if you look at recent news, for example, I mentioned GSK, that's had some issues around the anti-bribery and corruption campaign. In that case, the pharmaceutical industry in China is known for these sorts of corrupt practices, and it's very difficult for international companies to be sure that they're complying with the regulations, or indeed to understand how those regulations are going to be enforced from time to time. So, if, for example, you're a company operating in the pharmaceutical industry, you want to keep your ear out for those policy statements and those statements of intent that say we're going to crack down on corruption, we're going to reform the healthcare sector, and 2 + 2, you've got to work out what's going to happen for yourself, and you've got to not do that evaluation just at the point of your market entry. You've got to do it all the time, certainly every year, because things change so quickly. Another example that's been in the news recently was Aston Martin. I think they had to recall about 17,000 cars because of a faulty part. Now, it turned out that part was a fake piece of plastic, a fake DuPont plastic part, I think, in the mechanism of the car, which proved faulty. Now, that part came from a third-tier supplier in mainland China. And I don't know the detail, but I suspect that there wasn't a lot of due diligence done on that supplier. And there was a media investigation that went into the supply chain, and they found that the supplier was a very poor-looking business that more or less openly said they used fake parts. So you've got to be very careful with your supply chain if you're a foreign company in China, because you're expected to meet certain quality control procedures, and if you don't, your reputation can suffer massively. And you have to check those supply chain links on a regular basis. As I mentioned, prices are going up and there's pressure to control the end cost. So what happens is the supply chain gets squeezed and people cut corners. So that's another reason why people fail in the market.
So what do you think are the prospects for greater Sino-British business cooperation following last year's third plenum and the UK Prime Minister's trip to China?
So clearly there's massive interest in the UK for doing business in China, and that's why David Cameron was able to take over such a large group of companies with him. But I think there are a number of areas that are of particular interest. On the one hand, the rebalancing of the Chinese economy, which is a key policy for the Chinese government, means that in the long term there's going to be a massive opportunity in the consumer market for British business, both selling into China and also for serving Chinese people who travel outside of China. 100 million people by next year are going to be traveling outbound, probably 200 million by 2020. So there's an ability to serve that consumer market. And that's only going to be enhanced by the policy focus on increased urbanization. Again, not just consumer products, but also infrastructure investment and all the things that go with that. Thirdly, there is also a desire to increase China's business influence globally. So you have the outbound investment of Chinese companies and Chinese brands going global, so establishing their brands on a global basis. So I think there are some really interesting elements coming out of that. One of the other policy initiatives that China's focusing on is environmental protection. The UK has a very strong background in environmental engineering, renewable energy, these sorts of things. So looking at the policy, aligning with the policy, and following through on those opportunities, I think is a really good way for British business to go.
As you are a consultancy firm, so in your company this year, is that have more like clients compared to the past?
I think the type of client is changing rather than the volume of clients. So I think people are certainly since 2008 financial crisis, people have been much more attuned to risk and managing risk in China. And since the anti-corruption campaign has started in China, people have been much more aware of their compliance risks. So you've got the UK Bribery Act, you've got the FCPA out of the US. People are very concerned about some of the scandals that have been in the media about hiring the sons and daughters of government officials, bribery and corruption in the pharmaceutical industry, to name just two. So people are spending much more time looking at those compliance issues. And again, that comes back to doing the due diligence and then monitoring the situation as it unfolds.
So to summarize, what would be your key advice for British companies they want to enter into Chinese market?
Right. Well, I think the first thing I would say is think more broadly than entering into the China market. Think about engaging with Chinese business wherever they may be. So that involves businesses in China and businesses that are going global and investing overseas. Equally, the Chinese consumer. The consumer is not just in China. 60% of luxury spend by Chinese people happens outside of mainland China. So you can address a massive market by looking more broadly right at the beginning when you set your strategic question. The second thing I would suggest is that listen very carefully to what the government is saying. They lay out in some detail in the 5-year plan and during these major government meetings what their intentions are and where they want the economy to go. If you can align with those long-term plans and developments and you can adapt over time as they are refined and they change, you have a great opportunity. And I think the other point is that you've got to be prepared and you've got to be patient. You can't address the China opportunity overnight. You've got to take your time, build relationships, build your understanding, and adapt to the reality as you experience it.
Thank you, Jeremy, for sharing those valuable insights with Business World.
Pleasure.
And now in this part of the program, the focus is on Chinese consumerism. The Chinese market is vast, complicated, and rapid expanding. And the Chinese consumers are adapting with extraordinary speed to new technologies and products. But why are Chinese consumers said to have a huge impact not only inside China, but around the globe too? Here are some statistics which illustrate some of the answers.